Welcome, everyone, to the Exploring Liminal Diasporic Identities, examining the case of the Korean diaspora, presented by Kevin J. Kevin engages with future studies and foresight through his work, writings, and presentations. His numerous writings have appeared in academic publications like the Journal of Future Studies, as well as popular publications like the World Future Study Federation Human Futures magazine. To read about his other credentials, please visit his profile page on the conference website, which I'll link to in the chat. This session will last 30 minutes and it will be recorded. My name's Caressa, and I'm here to provide any support that you might need, and also to receive any questions that you might lodge via chat or the Q&A and make sure that Kevin gets them. And so with that, I'll turn it to you, Kevin.
Great. Thank you so much, Caressa. So I'm just going to share my slides. Second. Okay, can everybody see my slides?
They look great.
Okay, great. So I'll start. I'll just turn off my video because so you guys can focus on the slides. And yeah, so thanks everyone for being here, and I'll be talking to you today about liminal diasporic identities. And I'll be focusing on the case of the Korean diaspora in particular. And there's been a lot of large number of diasporic movements by this group throughout the past 2 centuries, 3 centuries, which makes it an interesting case to examine. And just a bit of an overview. In this presentation, we'll talk about why diasporic identities are important to discuss. We'll talk about the key research questions motivating the study. Then we'll go briefly over nationalism studies, or some key concepts of nationalism studies, to ground the research and the presentation. And then we'll talk briefly about the origins of Korean ethnic nationalism, which will give us a foundation to discuss the case studies of the Korean diaspora. And from the case studies, we'll talk about the factors that lead to the construction of diasporic identities. So I'll start off by defining diasporic identities. So by this term, I'm speaking of migratory communities with some degree of political or social coherence, or some degree of social or political unity. And this term has been in the past reserved for Jewish people, and then for people with traumatic displacements like the Chinese diaspora, the Armenian diaspora, etc. But now it's used for just migratory groups in general. So why think about this topic about diasporic identities? To begin, migration isn't a novel phenomenon, as it's been a part and parcel of human history going back millennia before the appearance of the state borders that we have today. But what makes migration so interesting to examine today are because of some of the signals that show that migration will be an increasingly important factor to study. So obviously there are what are often known as push factors and pull factors. And I mean, there are a lot of signals. We won't linger on this too much, but there's an increasingly aging population in a lot of the developed world. And given the declining global population, some argue that there will be a fierce battle or competition for talent as governments around the world fight over an increasingly declining and scarce human resources. There's also climate change and forced displacements from climate change leading to climate migrants. I mean, there's a variety of estimates and projections, and of course, no one really knows for sure what's going to happen. But recently, the World Bank, in a new publication, estimated 216 million climate migrants by 2050. And I just present this number to give you a sense of the scales we're talking about. And as we know, there's continued conflicts and forced migrations created by war and conflict. This is most evident in our current historical moment. Not to mention that the global economic order will also change in the future, making some destinations more attractive, and changing the nations that will be sources for migrants. And also in keeping with the theme of the conference, we can see that diasporic identities are liminal identities, because they're groups that navigate between or navigate in the borders, between the borders. So there are two, I'd say, main research questions that are asked for this study. And they are, one, what are the structural factors leading to Korean diasporic identities? And two, how might these structural factors help us think about diasporic identity formation in the future? I mean, given the potentially increasing number of migrants in the future, this is important to ask, as discussed before. So by talking about structural factors, we're talking more about, we're not talking about what individuals do or decide, but we're talking more at macro levels. And the Korean diaspora gives us multiple case studies to examine, to think about or approach the processes of diasporic identity formation. But before we get into the actual case studies, we need to better define what nationalism is and to help us think about what national belonging means. And here I present Benedict Anderson's very influential formation in Imagined Communities. It's actually one of the most cited works in the social sciences, even today, I think. And this is, I propose the following definition of the nation. It is an imagined political community. It is imagined because the members of even the smallest nation will never know most of their fellow members, yet in the minds of each lives the image of their communion. Finally, it is imagined as a community because regardless of actual inequality and exploitation that might prevail in each, the nation is always conceived as a deep horizontal comradeship. So what does, some key concepts or some things to draw out from this quote here and from his work in general. So nationalism isn't a bad thing or a good thing or something we should attach moral statements to. It's the way that people in nationalism studies discuss it. It's a social phenomenon. So it describes a social formation, an imagined community that provides meaning for its members, just like other social formations like kinship, religion, etc. And although a society might be hierarchical and unequal, on the level of ideals, nationalism is or horizontal comradeship. So it's a popular and inclusive consciousness of other members of the community. And for this reason, there's often the adopting of metaphors of family, fraternity, etc. And nationalism is often or is accompanied by some baseline cultural and often linguistic homogenization through education, creating a national cultural unity. So with this in mind, we can move on to the discussion of Korean ethnic nationalism. And sorry if this is a topic that's a bit unfamiliar with people here. But so ethnic nationalism is a particular manifestation of nationalism where the nation or nationality is defined in terms of ethnicity. So I'll just go over this really quickly, but it'll help us ground us in how Koreans became Korean in a sense. So Korea had long periods where there were 3 kingdoms on the Korean peninsula. And the first signs of national consciousness came during the Goryeo dynasty, when one kingdom took dominance over the peninsula, and there were signs of an emerging national consciousness among the elites. And this continued to get stronger during the Joseon dynasty. But at this time, this was an elite phenomenon. So there was a very strong caste system in Korea at the time, and only the aristocratic class, or the yangban, were culturally unified and had membership to the national community. So it wasn't, if we return to Benedict Anderson's definition, it wasn't a deep horizontal comradeship. So for non-elites, for just common people, they were excluded from the inclusion into the nation, and instead they had other stronger social bonds. So for example, the village, the region, the family, and the extended family or the clan. But it was during the period of Japanese colonization that Korean nationalism coalesced or started to become turn into its current form. So the Japanese colonial government, in response to fierce resistance by the colonized Korean people, started to promote this ideology of Naisen Itai, or it's literally translated as Japan, Korea, one body. So this idea suggested that Korean and Japanese people shared a common mythical ancestor, and were family just by this heritage. By using this idea, they attempted to dissolve resistance and incorporate their Korean colonial subjects into the Japanese Empire. But of course, there was little evidence to suggest that Korean colonial subjects had equal rights under the Japanese Empire. So in response to this, Korean scholars pursued scholarship that showed that the Korean race shared a heritage separate from Japan. So this created this blood-based conception of membership to the Korean nation, and went out against ideas of civic nationalism, which were also present at the time. So civic nationalism as in cultural nationalism. So being Korean as a matter of cultural understanding, as opposed to being Korean as a matter of blood, or who your parents were. So after liberation, Korea was divided into South Korea and North Korea. But both Koreas continued to be committed to this idea of the Korean ethnic nation, and saw reunification of the two Koreas as an inevitable result because of this. So I hope I didn't lose anyone there. But that's sort of a brief story of how Koreans became Koreans, or the genesis of Korean ethnic nationalism. Now I'd like to move on to the factors of diasporic identity formation. And here I should say that I looked through the literature on 3 Korean diaspora communities in China, in Japan, and in Canada. And I came up with these factors inductively out of the literature, although I'm going backwards by presenting the factors first here today. So these factors are what I call homeland perception, or how Korean society, the homeland, has institutionally and socially categorized diasporic groups. There's also host country perception, or how the host country, the migrant receiving country, whether that be Japan, China, or Canada, how they have institutionally or socially categorized diasporic groups. And there's also diasporic group agency. So the discussions and discourses happening within diasporic groups that led them to define their own identity. And there's also historical contingency. As we know, historical events, they're unpredictable, and they've intervened in the process of diasporic identity formation. So one thing I want to stress here is that diasporic identity formation is constantly being navigated and negotiated. So it's not set in stone. So in terms of homeland perception, or how South Korean society perceives these diasporic groups, there's a division between the pre-1960s diaspora and the post-1960s Korean diaspora. So the pre-1960s diaspora went to regions closer to Japan. So there was a sizable population in Japan, or to regions closer to Korea. So there was a sizable population in Japan, in Manchuria. Even in the former Soviet Union, there were 500,000 Koreans, Korean migrants. And migrants were often from the social and economic lower classes, and they were driven by push factors like poverty, class oppression, etc. Meanwhile, the post-1960s Korean diaspora went to regions further away, including Canada, USA, and they were often from a more privileged socio-economic class background and motivated by class mobility. So the difference in how South Korea treats these diasporic groups is the post-1960s diaspora are more institutionally included. So they're defined as semi-Korean citizenships with the Overseas Korean Act. And this there's an F4 visa, for example, that gives almost semi-dual citizenship, like the right for Korean nationals to work. And there's also, according to survey results from some decades ago, there's a difference in the opinion of Korean society as well on these Korean diasporic groups. So moving on to the specific case studies, I'll start off with Koreans in China. So in terms of host country perception, or how, in terms of host country perception, the Chinese Communist Party, or the CCP, offered Chinese citizenship to ethnic Koreans in the Manchuria region if they were in Korea before 1949. And they also created the Korean Autonomous Region in 1952, where Koreans in China were able to practice their own culture and their own language. But this changed to an assimilationist policy during the Cultural Revolution, and there was suspicion of Korean Chinese people by the Han Chinese majority. So there are these historical contingencies at play here. In terms of homeland perception, I referred to it briefly in one of the previous slides, but there's discrimination. So between Chinese, after China and South Korea normalized their relationship in 1992, because as you know, or perhaps don't know, South Korea and China were enemies during the Korean War, and there were tensions in this relationship, and there are still tensions now. But they normalized their relationship in 1992, leading to an avenue for return migration for Koreans in China, where they were met with discrimination. So facing hostility from both sides, the Korean Chinese took an active role to form their own identity, positioning themselves as a unit separate from China and South Korea. But as I mentioned before, things are always changing, and according to the literature that I read, the fourth generation Korean Chinese desire assimilation. Meanwhile, for Koreans in Japan, after Japan's defeat in World War II, Koreans lost their Japanese imperial citizenship. As I mentioned before, Japan previously tried to incorporate Koreans into the Japanese Empire. This meant that state policies excluded Koreans in Japan from state benefits and from institutions, infrastructure. For example, Koreans at the time were forced to make their own schooling system, create their own institutions to provide the basics for their diasporic group. Meanwhile, the Koreans in Japan that went back to Korea at this time were met with suspicion and discrimination because of their life in Japan, because of their experience in Japan. Later on, Japan did make it easier for non-Japanese to naturalize, however. So a lot of Koreans have adopted Japanese nationality. So there's been a shift in how Koreans in Japan have navigated these conditions. The first generation had an ideology of homeland return. They wanted to go back to Korea. But after finding that homeland is not this ideal paradise that they were imagining, in the second and third generations, they began to claim a separate identity. So a Korean, Japanese, or Zainichi identity. And finally, there is the case of Koreans in Canada. And this is a diasporic group that I'm a part of. So in terms of host country perception, policies of multiculturalism in the 1960s allowed non-white people to immigrate to Canada and also allowed them to claim Canadian citizenship and identity. But of course, there is some discrimination for non-white people. As for homeland perception, as I referred to before, Korean Canadians are a part of the post-1960s diaspora, and they're integrated into the national South Korean imagined community as semi-citizens. And generally speaking, Korean Canadian immigrants in Canada claim this hyphenated Korean Canadian identity with some variations depending on like migration generation. So I'll finish with this slide, and thank you so much for listening. I know this was a lot of information that may have been unfamiliar to some of you. Yeah, so I want to finish with this slide and talk about and ask questions about what this all means about for the future of diasporic identity formation, especially given the signaling increased migration in the future. So some takeaway ideas. One, it's very difficult to draw general conclusions since diasporic identity formation is historically specific. So across all of the case studies that I've shared across, for example, Koreans in China, Koreans in Japan, and Koreans in Canada, there have been different processes of diasporic identity formation. A second takeaway is that both home country context and the host country context is important. So it's important to think how nationalism or national belonging is formulated in both these two contexts, what the specific policies might be, and what societal treatment is of diasporic groups, whether it be like societal exclusion and othering or societal inclusion. And finally, diasporic groups have agency, and it's diasporic identity formation isn't set in stone. So it's important to think about what the discussions are happening, what kind of discussions are happening in these groups, and what the discourses are. And thank you. Please feel free to ask me any questions at this point. But thank you so much for listening. And I can stop sharing slides. Oh, sorry, Chris, I think you're on mute.
Ah, thanks for that. So I'm interested in, it was a very interesting presentation, a lot of cultural context that I was completely unaware of. And I'm interested in your experience as a Korean Canadian in the futures industry and how those two things came together to you and brought you into this conference.
Oh, so they're actually kind of separate because so this research was done as a part of my master's program, and it was in anthropology.
Mm.
And my exposure to future studies came after my master's in anthropology, when I was thinking about what to do with my life afterwards. And yeah, I came in contact with the futurists, and he told me the best futurists are people who read a lot of books, speak a lot of languages, and are kind of weird. And I felt like that sort of described me. So that's what from that point on, I started looking more into future studies and delving deeper into this community.
Oh, that's pretty great. Thanks. Where can folks contact you if they have further questions about your presentation or your background?
Oh, I mean, you can just email me. I can share my email in chat.
Perfect. That'd be great. Thank you so much. I'm just looking for information on the next session for today. It looks like we have a break-in sessions for just a little bit. Our next session starts in, looks like about 2.5 hours. We've got Proposed strategy for improving the information system with Fabrice Teguera. So please feel free to come back for that session. And oh, we have a question for Michael here. I don't know if you can see it in the chat.
Yeah.
Okay.
Oh yeah, I mean, I can connect with, yeah, Michael, I can connect with you afterwards, and we can see what comes up.
Great.
Am I able to speak?
Yes.
Kevin, I've got an artificial intelligence robot that may answer those 3 questions you had at the end in detail and in an hour. So I can't do it right now because I've got so many other things going on with the launch of this new system. But in the next 2 or 3 weeks, we could potentially run those 3 questions through the robot, and it might give you the answers to those things, which would be very interesting, wouldn't it?
Yeah, it would be interesting. And I haven't really thought about how AI could be used in the foresight process. So that'd be just interesting, just an interesting experience for me as well. I can like connect with you on
it hasn't
LinkedIn or
failed
something.
me yet. It hasn't failed me yet, and I'm interested in stress testing it. So I might not be able to get it run the first time around, but we'll look at it and see whether there are some things I should change in the prompting system to allow it to answer those questions. Because the more I can do things like this, the more the machine can do foresight exercises in 1 hour. Yeah. So I'd be happy to experiment.
Okay, no, thank you so much. I can connect with you afterwards.
Okay.
Yeah. And thanks everybody.
Thank you, Kevin. Good night or good morning.
Good morning it is. For us anyway.
Take care.
Did you say 2.5 hours for the next one?
That's right. So let's see.
Okay. I can go and have some sleep.
Just confirm. Yeah, get some rest. You've
I
been
will.
up for a long time.
I have.
Okay,
Been
bye-bye.
nearly every session. Take care. See you soon.
Take care. Okay, bye-bye.